You're listening to Contusion Broadcasts, where music leaves a mark, and the stories behind the music hits even harder.
Most artists still think the song is the product, but that hasn't been true for a long time. We tend to think music success is driven by songs. A great track breaks through, people connect with it, and everything builds from there. And on the surface, that still looks true. Songs go viral, charts move, streams spike. But underneath that, there's a different system shaping what actually lasts. Because what we're seeing now isn't just a shift in distribution, it's a shift in what people remember. For decades, the model was simple. Make a strong song, get it heard, repeat the process. Each release was its own moment, and success came from stacking those moments together. Even now, most artists still operate this way. They focus on the next single, the next drop, the next spike in attention. Because it feels like songs are what move everything forward. But if you look closely, songs don't actually hold attention on their own anymore. They trigger it. What holds attention is recognition. When someone hears a track today, they're not just asking, "Do I like this?" They're asking, often subconsciously, "Do I know what this is?" And if the answer is no, the moment usually ends there. The idea that songs drive everything didn't come out of nowhere. It was built into how music used to work. Radio-controlled exposure, retail-controlled access. Listeners didn't choose from infinite options. They experienced what was placed in front of them. So naturally, the song became the center of everything. It had to carry the weight. What changed wasn't just streaming, it was choice. Now, listeners are moving through endless content. Playlists, recommendations, short-form clips. And in that environment, a song isn't enough to anchor attention, because there's always another one. So instead of asking, "Is this good?" listeners rely on something faster, familiarity. And familiarity doesn't come from a single track. It comes from identity. Here's the interesting part. Even though the system changed, the mindset didn't. Artists are still optimizing for moments, still treating each release like it has to prove itself from zero, still thinking, "This next song is the one." But in reality, what's missing isn't a better track. It's a clearer presence. Songs still matter, but they don't operate independently anymore. They gain meaning and retention through what they belong to. In that sense, the real product isn't the song. It's the identity the song reinforces. At first glance, it looks like music is moving faster than ever. More releases, more content, more competition. But underneath that, what's actually happening is slower. People aren't just looking for something new, they're looking for something they recognize. Streaming doesn't push music, it tests it. And your listening history already shows which artist passed. In the last episode, we broke down the illusion, the idea that songs are still the center of everything. But if that's not what drives attention anymore, then what actually does? Because streaming platforms don't just distribute music, they observe behavior. And once you understand what they're measuring, the entire system starts to look different. Most people think streaming platforms promote songs, that if a track is good enough, the algorithm will push it out to more listeners. It feels like a pipeline, upload to exposure to growth. And in that model, success comes from quality, timing, momentum. But that's only part of what's happening. Streaming platforms aren't designed to push songs. They're designed to extend listening sessions. Every recommendation, every playlist placement, every autoplay decision is optimized around one question. Will this keep the listener here longer? So instead of asking, "Is this a good song?" the system is asking, "Does this increase the likelihood of continued engagement?" And that's a very different filter. If you look closely, the platform isn't tracking songs as isolated events. It's tracking behavior patterns. Things like, do listeners skip or stay? Do they replay or move on? Do they explore more from the same artist or leave? Do they return later or forget entirely? And over time, these signals build a profile, not just of the listener, but of the artist's ability to hold attention. This is where it shifts, because consistency changes behavior. When an artist has a recognizable creative identity, listeners are more likely to stay, more likely to explore, more likely to return. Not because every track is perfect, but because the experience feels coherent. That's why artists like The Weeknd or Billie Eilish perform so strongly in streaming environments. It's not just the individual songs, it's the continuity between them. Each interaction reinforces the last. From the outside, it looks like the algorithm picked this artist, but underneath, the system is responding to patterns, repeat listening, catalog exploration, session duration. In other words, return behavior. So what looks like discovery is often just the platform recognizing that listeners keep coming back. Streaming doesn't reward songs directly. It rewards what songs create, ongoing engagement. And the most reliable way to generate that is through identity that people recognize and return to. At first glance, streaming feels unpredictable, like success is driven by luck, or timing, or exposure. But underneath that, it's measuring something much simpler. Not just what people click on, but what they stay with. If the system rewards what people return to, then most artists aren't losing because of their music. They're losing because there's nothing to return to. And that's what we need to understand next. Discovery gets attention, sure, but return is what builds anything that lasts. In the last episode, we broke down how streaming actually works, not as a system that pushes songs, but one that measures behavior, and more specifically, return behavior. So if that's what the system rewards, then the real shift isn't happening in music, it's happening in how people listen. Because what we're seeing now is a move away from discovery and towards something more repeatable. For a long time, discovery was everything. Getting heard meant radio play, playlist placement, viral moments. If people found your music, that was the win. And naturally, the focus became, how do I reach more people? Because attention felt like the scarce resource. But attention was never the end goal. It was the entry point. What actually mattered, even then, was what happened after. Did people stay? Did they come back? The difference now is that streaming makes that behavior visible and measurable. What changed wasn't that discovery disappeared. It's that discovery became easy. There's no shortage of new music, no shortage of recommendations, no shortage of content competing for attention. So discovery lost its value as a differentiator because everyone has access to it. Which means what matters now is what happens after someone finds you. This is where continuity starts to matter. When a listener comes back to an artist, that's not random. It means something connected, something felt consistent enough to revisit. And that behavior compounds. One return becomes more streams, more catalog exploration, more time spent, which tells the platform, this artist holds attention, and the system responds to that. Most artists are still optimized for discovery. They focus on new sounds, new directions, new attempts to break through. But from the listener's perspective, that can feel disconnected. Every release feels like starting over. So even if a track works in the moment, there's nothing pulling them back. Continuity doesn't mean repetition. It means coherence, a recognizable creative identity, a consistent emotional space, a sense that each piece belongs to something larger. This is what artists like The Weeknd or Tyler the Creator execute so well. Even as their sound evolves, the world feels connected. So when listeners return, they're not just replaying songs, they're re-entering something familiar. Discovery starts the interaction, continuity sustains it. And in a system that measures what people return to, continuity becomes the real advantage. At first glance, it looks like artists are competing for attention, but underneath that, they're competing for recognition, because attention is easy to get. What's difficult is becoming something people come back to. If continuity is what drives return, then the next question is simple. What actually creates that sense of continuity in the first place? People don't return to songs. They return to what those songs belong to. So far, we've broken down 3 things. Songs aren't the center anymore. Streaming measures behavior. And what it rewards is return. Which leads to a more important question. If people come back to what feels familiar, then what actually creates that familiarity? Because it's not just sound, and it's not just consistency in release. It's something more structured than that. Most people think continuity comes from sonic consistency. Find your sound, stick to it, and people will recognize you. And to a certain extent, that works. But only up to a point, because sound alone doesn't create depth. It creates repetition. What people actually recognize is identity. Not just how something sounds, but what it represents. The emotional tone, the visual language, the perspective behind the work. That's what creates the feeling of, I know what this is. And once that recognition is established, every new piece reinforces it. This idea isn't new. Artists have been building worlds for a long time. Bands like Pink Floyd didn't just release songs, they created immersive album experiences. David Bowie didn't just change sounds, he introduced personas that carried meaning across projects. Even Gorillaz exists entirely inside a constructed universe. But what used to be artistic experimentation has now become structural advantage. Today, this approach isn't optional. It's aligned with how the system works. Artists like The Weeknd build cinematic arcs across albums. Tyler, the Creator, reshapes identity with each project, but keeps internal coherence. And because of that, each release doesn't start over. It extends something that already exists. When an artist functions like a world, every song has context. Every visual reinforces meaning. Every release feels connected. So when listeners return, they're not just replaying a track, they're stepping back into an environment they recognize. And that's what creates continuity. Not repetition, but structure. What we're seeing now isn't just artists evolving, it's the role of the artist expanding. From someone who releases music to something people move through, a creative system, a world. At first glance, it looks like artists are doing more than ever. More content, more visuals, more output. But underneath that, the real shift is simpler. The artists who last are the ones building something that holds together. So if continuity comes from structure, then the question becomes, how do you actually build that structure intentionally?
Artists don't become recognizable by accident. They become recognizable by structure.
Up to this point, we've been building toward one idea. Songs aren't the center. Streaming measures behavior. Return matters more than discovery. And continuity is what creates return. But that raises a final question. If the artists who win are the ones building worlds, then how are those worlds actually formed? Because from the outside, it can look instinctive, but underneath that, there's a structure. We tend to think strong artistic identity just happens, that some artists naturally have a clear presence, a distinct voice, a recognizable style, and others don't. So the focus becomes, find your sound, be original, stand out. But those ideas are vague, because they don't explain how anything is actually built. If you look closely, the artists who feel the most cohesive aren't random, they're structured. There's alignment between what they express, how they sound, how they look, and what they represent. And that alignment creates recognition, not because each piece is identical, but because each piece belongs. Underneath every strong artist world, there are a few consistent layers, not as rules, but as a framework. First, there's a core emotional or conceptual center, a specific space the work comes from. Then, there's a narrative direction, themes, tensions, ideas that repeat and evolve. Then, there's a sonic language, not just a genre, but a palette. And alongside that, a visual language, something that signals identity instantly. Individually, these don't create much, but together they form something cohesive. When those layers align, each new release doesn't stand alone. It connects. So instead of asking the listener to start over, you're inviting them back into something they already understand. And that's what creates return behavior. Because the experience feels stable, even as it evolves. Most artists don't lack ability. They lack alignment. The sound shifts too often. The visuals don't connect. The themes reset every release. So even if individual tracks work, the structure doesn't hold. And without structure, there's nothing to return to. What changed isn't that artists suddenly need to do more. It's that the connections between what they're already doing have to be intentional. Because in a system that rewards continuity, structure becomes visible. What we're seeing now isn't just a change in strategy, it's a change in how artists function, from creating isolated work to building systems that accumulate meaning over time. At first glance, it looks like the industry is moving faster than ever. More releases, more content, more noise. But underneath that, the advantage isn't speed, it's cohesion. Because what lasts is what holds together long enough for people to return. And if there's one shift behind all of this, it's this. The question is no longer just what the music sounds like, it's what the music belongs to.
This has been Contusion Broadcasts, where music leaves a mark, and the conversation doesn't end with the song.